So here we are going to look into the carrot and stick policy of the British Parliament under the provisions of 1861 Act. So here the carrot policy is nothing but the conciliatory aspect. The conciliatory measures were granted through carrot, whereas the stick is nothing but the control measures. Control measures under the same legislation. Both were included. Both were included under the same legislation. So there was increased political awareness. So here the carrot measures, I mean the conciliatory measures were included because increased political awareness. Increased political awareness among Indian population, especially the middle class, educated middle class. They are actually distributing some pamphlets and generating some kind of public opinion. So there is an increased political awareness in the Indian political landscape. So to pacify them, conciliatory measures were included under the provisions of 1861 Act. Got my point? Stick, the control aspect. So here after the 1857 Sepoys Revolt, there was a perception among the British circles that the powers of the Indian Legislative Council must have to be controlled. We have given the representation, we have separated the executive and legislative functions, but the functioning of the Indian Legislative Council must be controlled. So if we did not control the Legislative Council functioning, that may turn against the British interest, and in no time the British rule in India may collapse. It is very clear for British authorities. So they have included the control aspects or control measures in the 1861 Act to control Indian Legislative Council functioning. Right, under the same act, under the same legislation of 1861, there were two provisions: conciliatory measures and control measures. Conciliatory measures to conciliate or to pacify the educated middle class, among who actually there was increased political awareness. To pacify them, a kind of conciliatory measures were included to control the functioning of Indian Legislative Council, which may turn, if there was no controls, if there were no control measures were implemented, then the independent functioning of the Indian Legislative Council may turn against the British interest, and in no time the British rule in India may collapse altogether. This was clearly known to the British authorities. Right. So the carrot policy or conciliatory measures were taken in the form of, just go to them, expansion of Legislative Council. The Legislative Council was expanded. Official members were increased, and also non-official members were included. Official members were increased, and also non-official members were included, and also inclusion of Indian representation. So 3 Indians were included in the expanded Legislative Council of Governor General of India. These 3 members are Raja of Benares, Maharaja of Patiala, and also Sir Dinkar Rao. So there was an expansion of Legislative Councils, which was seen which was portrayed as a conciliatory measure, and also the inclusion of Indians, a conciliatory measure to pacify the educated middle class Indians, or to pacify the increased political awareness in India. And also the third thing is restoration of legislative powers to the provinces. A kind of provincial autonomy was granted to provinces in matters of legislation. In matters of legislation, the provinces now can have the legislative powers to accommodate regional diversity. They are now able to legislate on matters where regional diversity is required. On matters of uniformity, still the Governor General and his Executive Council is responsible for bringing out a particular law which applies across British India. So these are the 3 conciliatory measures which were implemented under the 1861 Act. Got my point? 1861 Act is responsible for bringing out conciliatory measures, also control measures. So now we are going to look into the control measures. Here the control measures are explicit declaration. So there was no such declaration under the provisions of 1853 Charter Act, which actually created a separate legislative council by separating the executive and legislative functions. By separating executive and legislative functions, separate legislative council was created under the provisions of 1853 Act. But at that point of time, there was no clear mentioning. There was no explicit mentioning that no bill could be introduced without the Governor General's prior sanction. So at that time, the members were allowed to initiate bills even without the prior sanction from the Governor General of India. On paper, it was there. That means there was no bar there was no restrictions on the introduction of bills. There is no prior approval was required from the Governor General of India. However, even under the 1853 Act, the real authority lied with the Executive Council. It is a different matter, but I am talking about the provisions. Under the 1853 provisions, there was no explicit restriction. There was no explicit restriction that for the introduction of a bill, Governor General's prior approval is required. But under the provisions of 1861 Act, there was a clear explicit mentioning that no bill could be introduced without the Governor General's prior sanction. Without the Governor General's prior sanction, no bill has to be introduced in India. And also veto powers were introduction of veto powers. Even after the introduction of a bill, which is introduced after the prior approval of the Governor General of India, and the Legislative Council has decided the matter positively. That means it want to bring that bring that bill into enactment. It has voted with a positive vote, but still at this point of time, the Governor General of India was granted with veto powers to withhold assent or withhold his signature to such a bill, right? So after introduction of the bill with his prior approval, even at the time of the enactment, he can withhold such a particular law. So veto powers were granted through 1861 Act to mention, to make sure that some control measures were there. Also, ordinance making power, introduction of ordinance making power. So ordinance making power, a dent on the Indian Legislative Council. Veto power, so the same thing. So it actually reduced the authority of Indian Legislative Council. Also, the 1861 Act under the control measures included the power to frame rules and orders, the power to make rules and orders in relation to legislative business. So in relation to legislative business, whatever the rules and whatever the orders that actually have to be implemented through Governor General of India. So the power was granted to Governor General of India to make rules and orders in relation to legislative business. In all these 4 ways, there was a control over the functioning of the Indian Legislative Council. So by this time, the British Parliament was in a view that to pacify increased political awareness, we have to include some kind of conciliatory measures. And to control the independent functioning of the Indian Legislative Council, we have to implement a kind of controlling measures over the Indian Legislative Council. So under the conciliatory measures, there was expansion of Legislative Council and also inclusion of Indians, and also the decentralization or delegation of legislative powers to the provinces. A kind of provincial autonomy was given, right? So under the ambit of controlling measures or stick policy, there were 4 important restrictions that were placed on the Indian Legislative Council. First one, explicit declaration that no bill could be introduced in the Indian Legislative Council without the prior approval of the Governor General. Veto powers also granted. Second one is veto powers granted to the Governor General. Third one, ordinance making powers were granted to the Governor General of India. And also the fourth one is the Governor General of India was given the authority to frame rules and orders. The Governor General of India was given the authority to frame rules and orders in matters in relation to legislative business. So in what way the legislative business has to follow? So the rules that describe the legislative functioning, or the rules and orders that describe the legislative functioning. So the authority to make such rules and orders was rested with the Governor General of India, right?